Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Five for Breakfast. We are now in our 39th episode of 2022. Before I kick off, I'd like to thank our sponsors of Five for Breakfast, including our gold sponsors, Graybar and Vetro. Last week, American Airlines held me hostage in Dallas and forced me to miss our Fiber for Breakfast session that we had scheduled with Larry Thompson to discuss his latest study on BEAD cost. Fortunately, my good friends, Tom Cohen, the Fiber Broadband Association's Chief Regulatory Counsel, and Mike Romano, NTCA's policy guru, were gracious to step in for me and provide a BEAD and Washington update. I like calling Tom and Mike the twin towers of broadband policy. They are definitely the best in our industry, and I am certain that no one was disappointed to hear what they had to say. For me, I like to take notes every time I hear them talk. So we've rescheduled Larry Thompson for Wednesday, October 19th. That's Wednesday, October 19th. So I hope you can join us then for that session. Early last week, I was just outside of Phoenix for the National Tribal Broadband Conference. It's a real great reminder on how critical it is for all of us to ensure that everyone, especially tribal nations, are connected with fiber broadband to close the digital equity gap once and for all. Today, I'm joining you from lovely Cape Town in South Africa. I have to say that Cape Town is arguably one of the most beautiful and amazing cities in the world. And I'm speaking at the Digital Africa Conference, as the desperate need for fiber is not limited just to North America. Speaking of North America, my good friend Jeffrey's Equianis, George Notter, issued a great report yesterday on his observations from SCTE from a Wall Street perspective. And he says, quote, "It is clear to us that nearly every cable operator, at the very least, is evaluating fiber. We also understand that a vast majority of U.S. cable operators are applying for federal funding grants and describing fiber as their end game." He goes on to note that smaller cable operators have been able to transition to fiber to the home much more quickly as they have more flexibility to overbuild themselves, while it is a little more challenging for the tier one cable operators, but still compelling. Hey, just a heads up, our next Regional Fiber Connect workshop is in Columbus, Ohio on November 3rd. This event is already on track to break all records, all those records we set in Copper Mountain last month. So you're not going to want to miss it, so please register today. Also want to bring your attention to a very important Fiber Broadband Association webinar on supply chain and key mitigation strategies. You'll hear from industry experts from the Fiber Broadband Association's Cyber Supply Chain Working Group, or Supply Chain Working Group. And they just finished a white paper that's just released. The press release went out today. So you're not going to want to miss that white paper and that webinar. We also have another great Fiber for Breakfast on today on the State of the States broadband mapping initiatives at the state level. This will be a drill down on what North Carolina and Georgia have been doing on mapping initiatives to prepare for the FCC National Broadband Maps and BEAD funding allocation. Before I introduce today's guest, I'd like to introduce Trish Ehlers from the team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thanks, Gary, and good morning to everyone who's joined us this morning. Before I go over a few logistical items, I'd like to once again thank our Fiber for Breakfast Gold sponsors, Graybar and Vetro. Now, if you'd all keep in mind that all participants are in listen mode only, to ask a question, you can just type it into the question box located within your control panel on the right side of your screen. We'll host a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's session. This presentation is being recorded and will be available to members only on FBA's website within 24 hours. You can find the recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. At the conclusion of the presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a very brief feedback survey. If you'd take a minute to do so, we truly appreciate your input. I'll pass it back to Gary to introduce our panelists and get us started. Gary?
Thanks, Trish, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week at Fiber for Breakfast, the twin towers of broadband policy, FBA's Tom Cohen and NTCA's Mike Romano, gave a detailed BEAD and Washington update. Today, our Fiber for Breakfast session is with Randy Lewing, the founder and CEO of Signal Analytics and broadbandtoolkit.com, Eric McRae, the Associate Director from the Carl Vinson Institute of Government at the University of Georgia, and Ray Zells, the Senior Director of Technology Infrastructure Labs at NC State University. So Randy Lewing is a 40-year veteran of telecommunications industry, and his work is focused on a range of regulatory and economic issues relevant to broadband infrastructure investment and closing the digital divide. Eric McRae manages multiple local, state, and national and international GIS projects and initiatives, and has served on and chaired numerous GIS and information technology boards and committees. Ray Zeiss' work is focused on K-12 education, and his team works on cross-cutting topics that impact the overall well-being of students, such as healthcare, access to broadband, and economic development. So welcome, Randy, Eric, and Ray. And for our audience, please type in your questions as we go, and we'll hit that in the Q&A at the end. With that, I will turn it over to Randy, Eric, and Ray.
Good, thank you, Gary. Let's see, so we can jump to the first content slide. Greetings, everyone. Basically, we have very recently written a white paper, called State of the States, Broadband Mapping Initiatives at the state level. And basically, what it does is it explores just the range of things that states are doing in preparation for BEAD and CPF funding and the associated decisions. Basically, we're at a time of unprecedented both opportunity and responsibility at a state level with IIJA and BEAD. You've got $65 billion in funding flowing in, and much of it is administered by the states, and with ARP CPF about 10 billion. And so basically, there's going to be, states have always had, or for many years have had broadband offices and have been very active, but right now the thrust of responsibility is high. And so one of the things we wanted to do was ask the question, what are states doing that is really powerful and innovative, that'll push forward the public discourse, and particularly things that could be models that could be used beyond their state boundaries. And what we found is that there are a lot of states that take FCC data and repackage it in some respects. Some go to their broadband operators in their state and pull in data kind of in advance of when it's released with the FCC. Others do various other things that visualize things on their maps. But we ended up looking really at two states that are doing have a very significant initiative going out and gathering specific types of data, and then importantly releasing it to the public. And in doing the latter, it becomes a very important part of the discourse. North Carolina has collected 111,000 speed tests, at the last count, and has an associated survey that does a deep dive. So that's those two actions in combination are very powerful. And then Georgia has sort of pioneered something akin to the FCC's fabric, in that it's got a large number of locations that are then being vetted through a process that is very similar to what's happening at a federal level. So next slide. And so this is just to introduce the three speakers. So I'm Randy Leaning and was the author of the white paper, and then Ray Zeiss has in North Carolina, and Eric McRae in Georgia. And just a quick note, those of you who haven't seen the white paper, there's a link in the bottom right of all of the most of the slides that gives you a link to that white paper. And also we'll have copies of the material we're presenting available from Jennifer or others in the association after the talk, and particularly within the white paper you'll find links to a lot of the very detailed content. So we would greatly encourage you to look at that. And for those of you who might be audio streaming, if you type broadbandtoolkit.com and grab the first white paper, you'll have it, and it's at the top of the list as well. So with that, let's go to the next slide. So this slide is, what we're going to talk about during today's session is, the substance of what is done, which is, quite significant. And we're also going to look, sort of step back and look at how can data be visualized, once it's collected. And so this is a list of some of the visualizations. And I'm not going to go through this, but just bear in mind that that's part of the message, and you'll see some of that as we get into the slides. So with that, let's go to Ray, and we'll hear about North Carolina's initiatives.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak to y'all today. I'm Ray Zeiss from the Friday Institute for Educational Innovation at NC State. You may wonder why an educational institute is worried about broadband. We have been focused on that topic for many years. In particular, all 2,500 public schools in North Carolina are connected by fiber today as a result of programs that we helped steward here at the Friday Institute. We also worked on putting Wi-Fi in every classroom using E-rate funds. And after we got that done, we needed to figure out how to connect all the students at home. So we've been actually working on this topic since before COVID, and it really became very popular. We were hired basically by the State Broadband Infrastructure Office to develop a survey tool and a speed test. And we looked with them across the industry at a number of other ready-made tools such as Ookla. And we kind of determined that they all have their place. The Ookla data, for example, is useful, but what we were looking for was a very high fidelity, not duplicated speed test. So our survey takes about 5 minutes to complete. The speed test is only 30 seconds, but we wanted people to actually physically type in their address and answer a few questions, and not use this as a way to test, is their Wi-Fi router working? So we kind of felt like a lot of the ready-made tests were kind of geared towards the more technically astute who were testing, various router configurations or Wi-Fi configurations, and you were getting a lot of speed tests at the same space, or they were heavily on cellular. And what we were looking for was street-level data from real people. And to take that a step further, we wanted to make sure we reached the people that don't have any internet. So we actually built a chatbot that you can call or text with your phone if you have no internet access at all at an address, and that collects your address and puts the data into our database. We can even tell if they're on a mobile or a landline based on that tool, which is pretty helpful. Our speed test goes to a single server in the center of the state of North Carolina that is peered with all the big carriers in a data center in North Carolina. And unlike Ookla and some other tests that have multiple servers all around the world, we basically really were only focused on collecting folks in North Carolina, and kind of wanted to normalize that to a single point that's on like a dual 40 gigabit server. Across 100 and however many thousand responses we've had, the chances of a bunch of people hitting that server at the same time seems to be pretty low. So we've never seen the utilization on that server even jump above like 5%. So I'm fairly confident we don't have any bottlenecks in our survey methodology. Let's go to the next slide real quick. We have surveys for the general population, farms. We even have one for community anchor institutions, and then we have the phone survey. And not every survey is exactly the same. There's no speed test, for example, in the phone survey, but what we've done is try to normalize the data into a single data set that people can download. We can probably go to the next slide just to show a snapshot of what the data. So what we do is we build a data dictionary, and we show which fields are available, what their exact names are. So for people that are service providers that are looking to find, where there are clusters that they might want to go after grant money, or other researchers, they can download this data, and there's a link I think we've shared, and do their analysis. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the next slide back to you, Randy, I think. Oh, no. There's an example visualization that the State Broadband Office does. I want to make sure we leave time for questions. So I'm just going to, let you look at that real quick. So this is the official speed test that's used by the Broadband Office to help identify clusters and areas in the state that need more investment. So.
Okay, and next slide. Okay, and so the next couple, 2 or 3 slides basically just show some visualization techniques that are interested and very timely given the context of BEAD. So in this case here, we're showing the results of speed tests, and you'll see two numbers. And if you can't see these perfectly, you'll take a look at the white paper, or you'll see it in a different context. But basically, there's a download speed and an upload speed. And then each of the speed tests are also color-coded as either qualifying, underserved, or unserved. So there's a color and numerical aspect to that. Next slide. And this is basically the same thing, but what we've done is we've tagged every block, with either a qualifying, underserved, or unserved color code based on the samples that are within it. And one of the critiques of crowdsource speed testing that we'll, I'm sure, talk about during the Q&A is that sometimes you've got people with inexpensive plans or other constraints. In this case, it's getting the best test within that geographic area. So that's a nice control component, and it makes a pretty picture. Next slide. And then finally, this is something where we aggregate the data into a larger polygon. In this case, it's a census tract, and we're showing median download upload speeds. But what's interesting here is even though your speed tests aren't in every block, but you've still got a lot of them, the data can be aggregated, and you do have a full color map for the entire state. Next slide. And
so in Georgia, we took a different approach, and much like Ray, here in Georgia, we've been working on broadband since the days of ARPA, when the first national broadband map. So we've had a long history in working with broadband mapping, but the one thing that we always had a challenge with was the accuracy. It just never seemed to be accurate enough to be able to make good decisions. And so in 2018, we started down a path to map out all locations in the state of Georgia that had access to what was defined as broadband at the time, which was 25 megs down, 3 megs up. We realize that is, probably woefully inadequate now, but at that time we felt that was good enough. It was also the FCC's definition of broadband at the time. We're using a commercial set of locations. We get that data set, we scrub those, get rid of duplicates, we validate against other data sources, and then we provide that data out to the ISPs if they sign a sublicense agreement to have access to it. But what we request of each ISP is to provide us with a list of all addresses that they do serve or can serve within 10 business days of a request, or even better, send us a footprint of the network in which you're going to be able to serve. And some send us the footprint, some send us the actual plant. So we get basically 3 different levels of data sent to us. We then take that, we aggregate that all together, and we generate the map. And the way we generate the map is if 80% of the locations in a given census block have access to broadband, 25.3 or greater, that census block is considered served. Anything less than that is considered unserved. In recent years, this past year, we've started looking at getting data for, and we started making the requests for different speed tiers, and we're going to start asking for technologies as well. We do make the data available in a census block format so that you can publicly download that, and that's what Randy was able to do as part of his white paper. What this gives us is a very high quality view of the state of the state. We can look at that and determine what does the FCC show versus what does the state of Georgia shows. This was very important at the beginning of the pandemic. We were just in the process of publishing our first map, and we were able to very quickly tell the Department of Education, for all the kids that were sent home to do virtual learning, which students did not have access to broadband, who didn't even have the ability to subscribe to it if they wanted to. And so we're able to point out the 160,000 students across the state that did not have access. Next slide, please. So this is an example, and I will say these big dark holes that you see in the state, those are completely unserved, 0%. There are no served locations in these in those census blocks. The green areas define those areas in census blocks which are considered served by the state of Georgia, and then the pink areas are those that are less than 80%, and so those would be considered underserved, but they have some service level in them. Next slide, please. And you can see an example here where we've zoomed in, and you can, it's a little hard to make out, but you know, the pink are 62%, 24%, but you see all the 0% throughout the slide. Those are all completely unserved census blocks. And generally speaking, the unserved census blocks in Georgia will mimic the unserved census blocks with the FCC, but we additionally can show at a census block level those census blocks which are underserved. Just because you're a green census block does not mean you're 100% served. It just means you have 80% of those locations or greater have service. Next slide, please. And this is another example that Randy put together that shows basically a color ramp from red being 0% to green being 100% to kind of show you how the state would look. And this is just zoomed in on that same area that we were just looking at to give you an idea of the number of unserved locations. And so we've been able to get a very accurate count of the number of unserved locations that we have in the state of Georgia. Next slide. Turn it back over to you, Randy.
Good. Okay, and next slide. Great. Okay, so this is a slide that basically just summarizes a few of the caveats on each of these techniques. And usually when you talk about either using a fabric or crowdsourced data, a hand in the audience goes up and says, "Well, what about this?" And we also talk about a lot of these caveats or footnotes in the white paper. Some of the issues, for instance, with crowdsourcing, consumers might choose a low price plan, so it may not be reflective of the ISP in the area. There may be a Wi-Fi constraints. Oftentimes, poor architectures or just people who don't know how to configure their Wi-Fi or using it right at the limits. There may be multiple users at home at the time of the tests. There may be devices that are not great, or for instance, in depending on some methodologies, there's a question of how do you do the location. So in some cases, you just may have a GPS available to actually precisely locate, in which case it's hard to get good measures on laptops as an example, or desktops. Now, in the case of North Carolina, they did a robust survey and then separately did the speed test. So that was an elegant solution to that. And then sometimes there just may be a limited number of data points, and that may make it hard. For instance, one thing that we found, just looking across the country at people who've tried, the states that have tried to do their own speed testing, oftentimes they'll start the process and they'll be challenged just in getting a sufficient number of results. And in one of the strengths, I think, in the way it was done in North Carolina is they had very, very good political participation from officials at every level, and that helped them hit some really good numbers as a percentage of the number of households. And then on the fabric, also a set of issues, but a different set. You may have areas where there are no actual tests. If it's based on advertised speeds, they may not be hit. You've got issues with some technologies, like with satellite trees can grow, or you could have weather conditions, or you may have bottlenecks in the network. And then also there's a delay between often when it's released, the information is released by the ISP, and when it's actually published. So with that, Let's open it to questions, and I'm sure we've got a few.
Yeah, thanks, guys. This is incredibly interesting and very timely with given everything that's going on. So I'll just start off with what was your what did come up between the 477 data and the mapping you guys did? What kind of differences did you see?
For us, it was a massive difference. Basically, 477 shows Georgia 97% served. It's pretty much so solid color served. When you take out and you look at it the way we mapped it and the methodology we use, it's a stark, subtle difference. And so,
was it closer to Broadband Now numbers, or was it even worse than that?
I think it's worse than that. Yeah, because
really?
Broadband Now, yeah, because we're driving down a little bit deeper than that. Yeah.
So like the FCC was saying 17 million unserved in the U.S. and Broadband Now is saying 42 million. So you're saying it's worse than 42 million.
Well, for us in Georgia, we knew that there were about 1 million unserved in the state of Georgia. So we feel that that's and according to the FCC, it was it was minuscule the number that were unserved in the state of Georgia, but per our numbers, population wise, we're probably 1 million, 1.2 million that were unserved in the state of Georgia.
What about you, Ray?
Well, actually, we saw Eric's map originally, and I think that was what got us to get the funding to actually do the map. And our goal was to have, we geocode to census block. I don't know the exact number, but there are thousands of people that are technically in FCC considered served blocks that typed in their address and said they had no access or came in with 1 megabit or horrible speeds. So we verified certainly that the data was overstated.
So when NTIA goes to do the allocation based on the new FCC mapping, I would suspect you guys would say that if you haven't done your own state mapping, you're probably not going to get your fair share.
That would be inaccurate.
Yep.
So let's talk about that a little bit. So some questions that come in saying, well, the FCC, so there's two different challenge processes, right? There's the NTIA challenge process and the FCC challenge process. So what the work that you guys are doing, both different methodologies in North Carolina and Georgia, will those be accepted during the challenge process for both NTIA and FCC?
So I believe that the work that we're doing, since we have to we have to use the FCC, we have to use their fabric to basically provide the challenge and then provide supporting documentation to show where we differ. I believe that we'll be able to use our information to challenge that. And NTIA, I also have confidence we'll be able to use our data to challenge that as well, yes.
I think so too, but that's up to our state broadband office. They're the ones that make the call.
All right, so see if you guys can answer this one came in. Do you have access to the FCC, do you have access to the FCC hub data to add to your fabric for better accuracy with data points?
We're in the process of getting that. Once again, our state broadband office, we're the mapping arm of that office. They've made the request, and as soon as they get it, they'll supply that to us, and then we'll do a county by county verification to see where we're different. And then we'll also look at some locally sourced information to get the most timely data available for purposes of our challenge.
Yeah, our state has a mapping office also. It's nc1map.gov, I believe, and they have a number of different broadband maps that they're working on with various different sources. This is just one project that they funded.
Again, I had someone come in and said, do any states have vendors that they use to do the mapping? So, you guys, your state's reached out to universities. I've seen Lightbox in some areas, and who else is this going to work? And where would a state, who should a state call to get working on some states?
I know Lightbox has done quite a bit of work with states, as well as CTC. I believe they're out of Maryland. They've done some work, and so I'm not sure. I'm sure CostQuest has done probably previous to having the FCC contract. They were probably doing some work at the state levels as well.
Yeah, same.
Well, great. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but Randy, Eric, and Ray, I really appreciate you guys sharing what you're doing. I think you're doing really important work, and there's billions at stake. So, it's just crazy when I look at 477 data, and so I'm glad you guys are doing what you're doing. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We're going to get back together next Wednesday, where I'll be discussing future-proof the world's fastest internet, why EPB took the leap to 25 gig. So if you haven't heard, Chattanooga is now a 25 gig city. So that's what Katie Espeth, the VP of New Products at EPB, and she'll discuss the benefits that the community expects now at 25 gig. So you're not going to want to miss that, and we'll see you guys next Wednesday. Thanks. Everybody.
Great. Thanks very much.